You're listening to the Colonialism Briefing Show podcast on Anchor FM.
Alrighty. Welcome back to another edition of the Colonialism Briefing podcast. My name is Jason Bett and I will be your host for this evening's podcast. It is now currently the 24th of April 2020, day 29 of the lockdown to the pandemic COVID-19. The president last night announced that we are now on level 5, which we're currently on. He mentioned the levels. Level 4, we'll be hitting level 4 on the 1st of May. God willing, we get there. Level 4 entails a couple of businesses that will open, like farms and that, industrial and mines and that, and some of them not to their full capacity. Some, one or two will be 100% and some 50%. Level 3 is the one to look for, where a lot of retail stores will open, and amongst them the bottle store where we buy our glorious liquor. I tell you, people have been going nuts these last few weeks. But yeah, God willingly, I hope we get there. We just need to carry on taking the precautions. We will get there. We will get to level 3, get to level 2 and level 1, and hopefully we can reopen the country and get back to our glory days. Okay, on to my podcast. Colonel Chris Wyatt. Supported to know that he's a retired colonel, and his views that he expresses in this podcast is that of his own private capacity. Exactly, that's important to know that. But let me read you quickly his bio that he's got on his LinkedIn account. Chris Colonel is a retired U.S. Army colonel with extensive security sector, international development and education field experience in Africa, Europe, Southwest Asia and North America. Specialities of foreign area officer, linguist, counterintelligence, counterterrorism signals, signal intelligence, education, international development, security assistance, security cooperation, security sector, reform in HIV AIDS, national security strategy, educational training. It's also to note that the colonel in the podcast is wearing a Stormers jersey. He's a massive rugby fan, which was cool. I got goosebumps seeing an American wearing a Stormers jersey, and on the back, on his screen, you'll see he's got a Springbok scarf there. Lovely, just awesome. I myself used to be a big rugby fan, but I lost all interest when the politics just really became too much in rugby. So I'll just watch the game occasionally, and I still support my team, the Stormers, and the rugby, but just not into it like I used to be. But the Colonel Chris, man, I gotta love his spirit. He loves his rugby so much, which you'll hear. Okay, so let's get into the podcast. Okay, cool. See you now. Colonel, good evening.
Welcome.
Well, it's a good afternoon for you, actually, but for me, it's good evening.
Yeah, it's still afternoon here, so good evening to you. How are you? Sawubona.
Hundreds. No, I'm good. Before we get into the podcast, for my viewers out there, give them a quick introduction, who you are.
Sure, happy to do that. So I'm Colonel retired Chris Wyatt. I was an active duty U.S. Army officer for 36 and a half years. I just retired on October 1st of 2019. And I was an intelligence officer for much of my career at the tactical, the operational and strategic level, and had the great privilege of actually writing intelligence products for the President of the United States when I worked in the intelligence community, among other things. And for the last half of my career, while I remained an intelligence officer and still did that work occasionally, I was a regional specialist for Sub-Saharan Africa. Normally, folks who do this in the Army focus on a region, and the region would be Sub-Saharan Africa. But I'm one of the unusual birds in that I also was stationed in North Africa, and so I have time in the Maghreb as well. And so I've served across the continent in Africa, in Tunisia, Liberia, Botswana, Malawi, Niger, Mauritania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. Those are actual tours, not I just popped in for a weekend for an exercise. I actually lived in those countries. Yeah. I've been to about 40 or so countries across Africa in official capacity. And I've worked peacekeeping, counterterrorism, international development, HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, Ebola, maritime issues, aviation issues, pretty much anything you think under the sun. By way of education, I'm a historian and a political scientist, and so I have lots of interest, epidemiology, virology, which makes that for a fascinating time right now with COVID-19 floating around out there.
Yeah.
So I've done a lot of things. I've also worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, at the Pentagon. I served with U.S. Africa Command at its headquarters and across the continent, and I was one of the original people assigned to it. So I've done a lot. I have a book coming out here shortly, a chapter, and a book coming from Stellenbosch talking about the U.S. Africa Command and its origins.
Oh, that should be cool.
Yeah, I was invited to be a chapter author, and I have not the lead chapter, but the lead-in chapter for talking about U.S. Africa Command and its evolution and what it is and what it isn't. So I'm just waiting for them to approve that. But I'm a published author, both on popular media and academic articles, things like that. And I have a fair amount of experience on the radio and also on television, because many times what we're doing in official capacity, we want others to know about it for transparency purposes. So I've spent a lot of time working with public affairs and strategic communications as well. So try to be as open and transparent as possible. For a long time, I'll finish up in just a second here. It's a bit of a long intro, but for a long time, of course, you can't have serving commissioned officers saying things about prescribing policy for government or saying that you've done something right or wrong. So we accept restrictions on our freedom of speech as serving officers. It's not onerous, but we do it. And so one of the things I want to do is, once I retire from active services, I'm trying to get more Americans in particular, but people in general, to pay attention to Africa and invest in Africa to help Africa develop and grow, but also so we can make money too. It's a two-way street. Both sides can gain. Africa is really a rounding error for much of American business. And so I'm trying to get business interest in that. So anyway, so that's a little bit about me.
No, cool. Before we get into it, I see you got your Stormers top on. I should have put mine on, but I'll show the viewers that I am also a Stormers supporter.
There you go. We were going to question whether it's true or not. It's backwards. There you go.
There we go.
All right. That's awesome. But not only am I a Stormers supporter, I think I mentioned to you is, let me turn around here a second and you'll be able to see it. You see it?
Oh, that is so awesome.
So
who made this? That is awesome.
I'm waiting for Western Province to send me a contract so I can try out for them, and I'll be at the left wing.
No, that's amazing, man. That's amazing. All right, let's get into it. The first question. COVID-19 and the economy have not become good friends. How will the world get back to its glory days? And we can expand a lot on this. There's a lot of categories to this type of question here.
Yeah.
But
well,
No, but before.
No, I was going to say.
Yeah, no, carry on.
Go ahead.
I was going to say those two links, because I wanted to do a share screen, but for some reason I can't do a share screen, then it freezes, my computer freezes. I don't know why. But those two links, the one was, and I'm going to put it on edit, when I edit the video later, I'm going to put it on screen so everybody can see. The one is Flight Tracker, where you can see the amount of airplanes flying now, current, present. And then the other one is to show the infection rate in the various countries. It's just interesting to see the type of infections that you have in the US, and then Europe, and UK, and then of course China. And then Africa, where I am at the moment, which we've got complete lockdown. It kind of makes sense because you can see that Africa, there's no flights. There's no flights in there. So that was just something that just grabbed my attention. What's your take on it? Do you think it could be because of the type of lockdowns that African prisons are doing? Compared
I think it's a combination of the two. I think it's a combination of the question of lockdown, but it's also it's a statement on what the internal market for air travel is in Africa. It's not nearly as heavy as it is in Europe, intra-Europe and intra-North America. So the number of flights you have in the U.S. domestically each day, a number of thousands and thousands. You don't have that degree of air travel internally in Africa. You have a few flights between here and there, and you add them up in the aggregate across the continent, you're going to see a far lower number than, say, just the U.S. alone, let alone Europe or Asia. So that's part of it. But also part of it is that the lockdowns are being done differently in different places, of course. So Europe has so many countries in such a small geographic space that you could have flights inside of Germany, for instance, flying all over Germany, and there is a large internal domestic air schedule. I know I've flown inside Germany. say Stuttgart to Munich or Stuttgart to Berlin, things like that, Frankfurt to Berlin. And so you have a large domestic market all over Germany for air travel, same in the UK. So the lockdown has one impact. But here in the US, the lockdown is done, we have a federal system, and so each state is responsible for whether they have a lockdown or not. And for example, I live in Pennsylvania on the East Coast, and when the lockdowns started, the governor of this state only imposed lockdown restrictions on the county surrounding Philadelphia in the southeastern corner, which is along the main route, the avenue where this virus is traveling, the I-95, the interstate route. And then also in Pittsburgh out the west, because that's where the hotspots were. At this point, after we've now had the official lockdown here in Pennsylvania for about 5 weeks, we have in the county that I live in, with 450,000 people, just 531 cases of this that are confirmed. So there are different degrees of lockdown. So if I needed to travel for some legitimate reason, I could travel by air. But frankly, I'm not interested right now. So, but a lot of the.
But
I remember. Yeah. I remember where it was, and I know you're editing this, so that helps. I was in the process of saying that the Federal Aviation Administration requires us to operate a certain capacity, as do many airports. And if you don't rock up at the terminal, at the gate with your aircraft, then you suffer penalties, both financial fines or you lose access to gates, which is what it's really all about for access to markets. So unless the federal government eases those restrictions, and I don't know the current status of that, that was a discussion about 3 weeks ago. I haven't really paid much attention to it. A lot of aircraft were flying virtually empty, almost no one on, even though it was costing the airlines money. And a number of environmentalists who are aware of how the airline industry works were complaining, why are these aircraft in the air? Ease the government restrictions so that they don't have to make these flights and don't lose their lucrative routes. And so that's also part of the reason why you're seeing a lot more aircraft in the air than we would expect with the lockdown.
Yeah. Economy-wise, I know our economy is just not looking good. Lots of my friends that I'm on the groups that I'm on Facebook and on WhatsApp groups, and we all complaining heavy. Our economy is suffering big time. And that's probably why I was asking about the airplanes and flying, and that means that trade is still going on. But oil, we've seen a huge drop in oil now. You mentioned to me not the last time you saw a price like this was what, 2019 in the 90s, eh?
No, I was saying that, actually I was in the midst of a live stream the other day, and someone said, did you see the oil price? I had missed it because I've been on air for like 3 hours. I was getting tired. And so I missed the news that oil futures for May had dropped to minus $37.50 US for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. Another of my interests is the energy markets. That's something I follow. So I had never seen that. But what I was mentioning to you when we chatted is that last time I remember the price of a barrel of oil for the current spot price that you buy in the marketplace being so low was about 1985 when West Texas light crude had dropped to $9 a barrel. And so when this person mentioned this to me, they didn't mention the price. They just asked me what had happened to oil. And I said, well, listen, frankly, I haven't looked at what's going on. I have no current figures for global consumption, but it has to have fallen off a cliff. On a normal day in 2020, before COVID-19, the world consumes about 100 million barrels of oil in the aggregate, the whole world, per day. And there's no way that we're consuming 100 million barrels of oil. We're probably consuming, I was guessing 30, 35, maybe 40 max, probably less than that. So I told those folks, I said, before I got the information, I said, if in the reality here, I would expect oil to be less than $10 a barrel right now, probably about $7 a barrel. And then I got offline, I went and checked, and futures were trading for minus 37. But the spot price for Brent crude in the European Union and for West Texas Intermediate was still $25, $27. So oil is still selling. It's oil futures that are selling for less. And the reason the oil futures are selling for less is because at the rate that the Russians and the Saudis are still flooding the market with oil, there's nowhere to store it. And so they're paying suppliers to hold on to the oil. So I was on the other day on a broadcast, and I jokingly said to the host, I said, listen, if you've got some spare storage capacity in the Eastern Cape, I'll pay you to take some oil off my hands. So that's what's happening.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are asking that if they've got extra storage now, buy some oil now. So of course the price is going to go up. And then lots of people are going to profit from it.
Absolutely. Well, here's the thing. Not many people are talking about it. Those who have lots in the way of resources, actual dollars, rand, or euros, whatever it is, yen, those who have a lot of money in the bank or have access to that are the ones who are going to come out of this smelling like a rose, because there will be some economic recovery to some degree. It may be painful. It could take a long time. But those who can buy assets, I mean, you can buy Nedbank for just a few rand right now. It's a profitable bank. It's one of South Africa's biggest 5 banks. Yeah. It's unlikely it's going to go under as a result of this. and you can buy it, and you're basically getting the dividend for free. So those who have access to this, and of course have a strong stomach, you have to have a strong stomach for investing in a long-term horizon, they're going to do well. Now, there's going to be a lot of companies that don't make it, so it's a risk. But my point is that those who have the resources are the ones doing well. It's the majority of people who don't have a reserve of cash, who can't sit back and just relax through this, who are living in Alexandria or in the Cape Flats or, in Nairobi slums. They're the ones who are going to suffer from this economically. And frankly, the impact on Africa from this, in my view, is really about economics. Africa is being destroyed economically as a consequence of governmental decisions with these draconian lockdowns. Really, in my view, need to be addressed weeks ago, not today, but weeks ago.
You see, countries like Italy, and including the US and lots of other countries in Europe, they can afford this little lockdown, Okay, I'm sorry, it's not little. This big lockdown, this huge lockdown. Yeah. So they can bounce back. I know they will. But like you just said, it's us in South Africa. We're not going to bounce back unless you have got some cryptocurrency lying around somewhere and it's backed by gold or even silver at the moment. I believe there's a trade in silver at the moment. Prices in silver has seen an increase. Yeah. I'm worried.
Like these, it's times, well, you have good reason to be worried, unfortunately. I don't like to be a Cassandra and say the sky is falling, but there's some serious concerns here. So it's interesting to watch politicians change their tune. So the African National Congress, Tito Mboweni, the finance minister, just over a week ago said that we are not approaching the IMF and the World Bank. We don't want any money from them. We can make this on our own. Yeah. And I did a video at the time and I said, is he smoking? I didn't say this, but I mean, seriously, is he smoking crack? There's no way. The coffers are empty. You can't borrow money unless you pay 8, 9, 12% interest because South Africa has junk status for its sovereign debt. And yes. There's been a lot of news about that recently, but it's had junk status for 4 years. It's just that Moody's was the last credit rating agency that finally downgraded them. So now everybody says it's junk. So, of course, the ruling party will claim that COVID-19 is the reason for the misery in South Africa, but it's actually their macroeconomic policies, which are frightening away foreign direct investment and which are stymieing and stifling initiative and entrepreneurship. Yeah. So it's crazy when the government occupies such a large percentage of the economy, but then discriminates against its business community by only letting people get contracts based on their skin pigmentation. That's not a wise business decision. And that's what South Africa is going through right now.
Yeah, of course. So, well, I believe in free market and I believe in capitalism. I consider myself a capitalist. I think I've said this to a couple of my friends. It's up to us that believe in the free market and capitalism. We are the ones that can actually uplift the economy again and create jobs. Because let's face it, we don't want to go down this socialist little rabbit hole that everybody is talking about at the moment and everybody's in panic and in awe. So I believe as a capitalist, we've got the resources out there. We can uplift this economy again. So the idea of this podcast is not to send out negative waves out there that after this lockdown, everyone's going to be in financial ruin, which of course there are, but there is ways to uplift the economy.
Well, absolutely. And so for one of the things, and I dearly love South Africa and South Africans. Those who know me know that about me. Why am I wearing West Province? There's one representation. But listen, here's the reality, and I don't mean to be critical of a lot of my friends in South Africa, particularly white friends in South Africa, who are frustrated by the BEE certification, all that nonsense, Black economic empowerment, and that's how I view it as nonsense. It's a racist policy. But a lot of people say, I can't do business in South Africa because of BEE. Well, the BEE applies to government tenders. It doesn't mean you can't do business on your own. And so I view far too many people automatically defer to looking to business from the government. Now, I realize the government occupies a big sector of the economy in South Africa so that you can't ignore the government. But if you're prohibited from going to that market, there are other places to go, and you can make yourself competitive and you can compete for the other business, the suppliers who need things from you to supply their contracts to the government. And also, one of the great things that happened with the end of apartheid, and a lot of people forget, is that, apartheid was very oppressive for everyone. It wasn't simply for people of color, Black South Africans who were oppressed. Now, I'm not trying to say the degree of oppression was the same. There were plenty of white South Africans who fought for liberation, who were banned, who were imprisoned. We had Sun City because of the Dutch Reformed Church and Calvinism and the strict conduct in public. So in many ways, the entire political system of apartheid was oppressive and stifling to many, many folks. What I've seen since the end of apartheid, particularly in Afrikaans community, is a blossoming of culture, language, but especially of music and arts, where people are now free to express themselves. You see that. I mean, one of the top Afrikaans singers is homosexual. Really? African community, openly homosexual, yet people love his music. My point is that what should have happened in addition to this is that South African businesses, which had been prohibited from investing in Africa because South Africa is the natural seed bed for growth across Africa and for foreign direct investment, it should have been coming from South Africa. Now, it was from 94 until recently, a lot of the foreign direct investment came from South Africa, but it came from ShopRite and Edcon and Old Mutual and Anglo American. These huge multinationals, they're South African with London listings or New York, but they're South African multinational diversified companies, and they're huge with billions and billions of sales. What I'm getting at is that the small South African entrepreneur, particularly minority entrepreneur, ought to be looking further afield, particularly within SACU, the Southern African Customs Union. You got Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, South Africa, not to be offensive to those countries, but let's be honest, in many respects, their economies are largely extensions of South Africa's economy in SACU. And then you have the wider SADC at which people can go. And my argument is that entrepreneurs ought to be looking. So if you live in Pretoria and you're not looking at Gaborone as a market for whatever you're doing as an entrepreneur, you're not really thinking very creatively and you're missing out on opportunities.
100%.
And so for instance, you can go across the border to Botswana, which is very easy to do business in. It's a small market. Let's keep that in mind. 2 million plus people. It's a small market, but it's a well-developed market. You can register your business. It's free of corruption almost entirely. There's corruption, but there's almost entirely free of corruption. The police are honest, easy to do business. It's right next to South Africa. It's in a customs union. So things like that you should be looking at. Anyway, not just the big corporations. And I encourage small entrepreneurs in South Africa to be doing that.
No, I agree. Botswana and Namibia, there's lots of potential there. I'm just trying to think which country it was. Was it between Namibia or Botswana? They admitted on some newspaper that they're too afraid to expand. They're too afraid to get more people and expand the country. I mean, Botswana is what, 2 million? Their population just over 2 million.
2 million, yeah.
Namibia is also about 2 million. And they've got all the, what resources? I'm just trying to think of the resources they got now. I forgot now. But there is some resources.
We're all endowed with resources. So Botswana has the best gemstone diamonds on the planet, largely from the Jwaneng mine. They have the Arapa mine and several others. They also have copper, nickel, and massive deposits of coal, plus coal bed methane. So lots of methane gas under there. And of course, Namibia has alluvial diamonds that came from the Orange River and washed up along the Skeleton Coast. Uranium, they have lots of other, so they have wealth of mineral wealth, not to be redundant, but a vast endowment of mineral wealth. Neither has great agricultural potential. What they do have is mostly cattle and sheep. There's some green farming, garden farming, but not much. And so they're dependent on their neighbors. But there's a lot of potential. But my point is, that's a start. Let's say I live in Rustenburg and I have this idea for a business, a restaurant, and I want to start it and it takes off in Rustenburg. Okay, why would I automatically go to Pretoria? I could go to Pretoria, it makes sense, but Gaborone is not much further and it's easy to get to. Why not expand it there too? And the culture is similar. They're Tswana-speaking people, and the white Botswana who live in Botswana some are Afrikaners and some are English-speaking. So it's the same sort of environment. But that's a start. And then you should be looking at somewhere like Rwanda, considering Rwanda. Let's say you make personal protective equipment.
Rwanda's good, eh? Rwanda's growing. Their economy is growing big time.
Yeah, its size is only about 12, 16 million people, so it's not a huge market either. But you really have to, I did a presentation, we had this event here in the United States in Chicago, it comes every year, it's called Trade with Africa Summit. And I went there last year and spoke, the woman who organized it used to be an executive for Walmart, she's from Nigeria. She asked me to speak about the current state of U.S.-Africa trade. And part of my presentation is because I don't like to just whinge about things. I like to say, here's some solutions, because we can all complain. That's what Twitter's for. But we actually want to do something constructive.
Cancer. Twitter's a cancer.
It is a cancer. So usually in my videos, I'll try to, if it's a topical video, like I have one on, South African Airlines, let's fix this mess. And when they were going to go into liquidation, I said, they're going to go into liquidation, no choice. But before I did, it was before liquidation, I said, this is what South African Airlines could do to, improve itself and survive or reorganize. Anyway, but my point is that with that presentation I gave in Chicago, I talked about lily pads for investment in Africa. And I was talking about Americans specifically. And I pointed out places in Africa where, and different sectors of the economy. So I talked about Botswana, Mauritius, Rwanda, Cape Verde, places like that. That's another one. Now, different size markets. So depending on what your market segment is, you can get in these different markets. Anywhere between, I was showing economies between 2 million people and about 50 million people across Africa that have sound business practices, have honest governments, low corruption, and have reasonable access to lines of communication and air links and sea links, things like that. So
Beautiful.
those are just my ideas. So that's
Beautiful.
I like to offer ideas. Yeah. So
it's music to my ears, Colonel. It's music to my ears. Music. All right, my next question.
Well, it's
Yeah.
before you get that question. So some people might say, well, why does this colonel care about this? He's not an economist. What does he know about investment? Well, I learned long ago that, we can say we have freedom, and you can have charters, a freedom charter, and you have a constitution, you have a declaration of independence, and you can have a country where we have free speech. A human being is truly not free unless they have the means to enjoy their freedom.
Thank you.
You all need we need a little bit of scratch so we can go where we want, do what we want, and raise our families the way we want and engage with others. And so I learned long ago that whether we like it or not, and I'll tell you an anecdotal story. Can I tell this anecdotal story? I think it really adds to the conversation.
Go for it. Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right. So I was in the first Gulf War, and I was a young second lieutenant. This is after I'd gone in the Army and then gone back to university, came back as an officer. And I was there, and everyone was saying that this was George Bush's war for oil. It was all about taking the oil from Iraq. It was 1990. And so I sat there, and after the war was over, and I saw what happened with the Republican guards that we engaged in combat, and I saw what the Iraqis had done, looting and abusing and raping and pillaging in Kuwait. I said to myself, I said, you know what? I watched the price of oil go from like $12 a barrel to $27, $30 a barrel overnight when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and people thought he was going to invade Saudi Arabia in August of 1990. Then I deployed to Saudi Arabia, and then after the war, I said, you know what? If it's about oil, so what? Sadly, whether you like it or not, the world's economy at that time, and in large measure to this day, is dependent on the access to inexpensive energy for growth and development. That's just a reality. So until someone invents coal fusion in their garage, we're kind of stuck with energy. Now, energy mix has changed over time, but my point being is that it is about economics, it is about money, and that is what makes the world happen, and that's what drives political intercourse, or discourse, excuse me, or intercourse. So my point is that I learned a long time ago that since I dealt with intelligence and security, that if you look at security holistically, you had to understand economics, you had to understand what the pressure points were and why people make decisions based on money. So that's one of the reasons why I study it.
No, 100%. No, hundreds. Succession. Can people succeed from a country if they are not happy with the current affairs that are experiencing in their country? And of course, we need to bear in mind if it's recorded in the Constitution to do so. But now, to give a little bit context into why I'm asking that question, and it sums up with the first question. We were speaking about the economy, that a lot of people are getting scared, they're getting negative, and we've seen this a lot. So people for the last 2 years, maybe, a lot of people have been talking about secession, trying to succeed and break away from the government. What's your take on it? You think it's possible?
Well, okay, let's wrap this in a few things. So let's look to a few documents. Founding documents matter, and legal documents matter when it comes to issues like this, and so it's important. So I'll turn first to the Freedom Charter of 1955 from the Congress of the People, not the current political party, but the amalgam, which include the ANC
That's right.
and African Congress and others. So 1955, Cliptown, June 26th, this declaration was made. And in the very last section of the Freedom Charter, where it says there shall be peace and friendship, with an exclamation point, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth section here says the right of all peoples of Africa to independence and self-government shall be recognized and shall be the basis of close cooperation. So in the Freedom Charter, all those who declared their support for the Freedom Charter in 1955 believed in the ability of all peoples across Africa for self-determination. They say self-government, but the implication there is self-determination. So that's the Freedom Charter. Now let me shift to the United Nations Charter. In the United Nations Charter, Article 1, Section 2, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. So right there in the United Nations Charter from 1946 or whenever it was, or 45, there is the Declaration for Self-Determination in the first article of the United Nations Charter. South Africa is a signatory to the United Nations, and it is a member in good standing of the United Nations. And then finally, the 1996 Constitution, which is the current Constitution South Africa lives under, Section 235 has a section specifically on self-determination. And that says the right of the South African people as a whole to self-determination, as manifested in this Constitution, does not preclude, within the framework of this right, recognition of the right of self-determination of any community sharing a common cultural and language heritage within a territorial entity of in the Republic or in any other way determined by national legislation. So the Constitution itself allows for self-determination. Now the question comes, what do we mean by self-determination? Are we talking about seceding? Are we talking about self-rule, self-autonomy, things like that?
Yeah.
It's actually a very important question. So you have an interesting case study. Now, first, I should say that when it comes to self-determination, there's no international definition for what that means. The United Nations didn't elaborate on it. International treaties don't elaborate on it. People talk about it, and lots of people seek self-determination. But there's a hazard. How far do you go with this? I mean, as humans, we tend to associate with a larger group. So when the Springboks are on the pitch, everybody's a Springbok fan in South Africa, for the most part. Or when Bafana goes out and embarrasses itself on the pitch, we're all Bafana fans, right? Okay. So, sorry, I couldn't help that.
That's all right.
Not a real game. Come on. The yellow card touched me. Come on. Anyway, all right. So then we're all fans. Nigerians will squabble amongst themselves about whether they're Muslim or Christian, or they're from the coast, or they're from the Delta, or they're from the north. They'll have all kinds of divisions that break themselves down. But when the Nigerian soccer team is on the pitch, everybody's waving a flag for all Nigerians. My point is that at what level to allow self-determination to take its course? So famously, in recent history, we have the devolution of Yugoslavia, which was comprised of multiple ethnicities and religions. We had Eastern Orthodox with Serbs. We had Croats with Roman Catholicism. We had Bosniaks who were largely secular Muslims, and multiple languages spoken, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and it broke up. And the consequences of it are still reverberating today. Now, we've also had self-determination in what was Czechoslovakia, and they had the Velvet Divorce, in which they became the Czech Republic, or now they call themselves Czechia, which is confusing because we have Chechnya in the Caucasus, but Czechia and Slovakia, and they seem to have done okay. But you could take this further and further and further. There's an ethnic group in Germany who are Slavic, who have been in Germany for millennia. They're called the Sorbians. Sorbians, not Serbian Sorbians. They live in the eastern part of Germany. Are they entitled to self-determination? A smart approach by governments, I think, is when they give a degree of autonomy or self-rule to groups that feel that they need to have their own path. Now, that works when a group is inside of one country, one territorial area, potentially. But when you have a group like the Kurds who live across 5 or 6 different countries or something like that, it's difficult to get self-determination. The Kurds have famously been sold down the river. In South Africa's case, I made a couple notes here. So I'll give a couple more examples of self-determination where it can work, but it's not secession. So in Italy, at the end of the First World War, because the Italians changed sides and joined the Allies, they were rewarded and given Austrian territory. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up after the First World War. The territory of what was South Tyrol, or Südtirol, became part of Italy, even though it was about 70% ethnic German, only about a third Italian. And so it was part of Italy. And then the Second World War, the Nazis, Hitler and Mussolini had some other deal. Anyway, after the Second World War, it eventually got largely self-autonomy. So it is a province in Italy. It pays taxes in Italy. It is part of the country. It follows the legal rules. If you look at the alpine skiers, most of them have German names because they're from that region, and they ski for Italy. But they do have a degree of self-autonomy, and their provincial legislature has a lot more control over many aspects of life in that province. The Kurds I mentioned. Now, look at the United Kingdom. All the challenges they have, it's in the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland. Of course, the Scots are forever being persnickety and wanting to go their own way and have their own parliament, and they have that. And they're always talking about devolution, but they have been together for several hundred years. And then there's even things like you look at Germany. Germany is comprised of multiple what used to be kingdoms, principalities, municipalities. And even today, when you drive into Bavaria, you still see signs in German with the Bavarian royal emblem, and it says Freistaat Bayern, means the independent country of Bavaria. It's part of a federation, a country. So self-determination, you've actually got an example in South Africa about self-determination that is just kind of tolerated, I guess is the word to say, and that's Orania.
Orania. I was thinking about Orania. Yeah.
Yeah, Orania is the place I'm thinking of. And that's a place where the folks who live there bought the land and set up their own community. They even have their own currency now. So
Ora. It's called Ora. Yeah, Ora.
Yeah, the Ora. Yes, that's correct. So I think that's a bit odd, but I mean, that's their path. At various times, they've been attacked as being racist or exclusionary. But then usually when people from other communities go there and visit it, they find out that at least that's what they say. It's not what they find out. They just find out that this is a group that wants to retain its cultural ties, its religion, its language, and live its own path. And so if self-determination is in that fashion, then it can work, I think. But right now, I know where you're going with this. Is a lot of people are very angry with what's going on. But so the question becomes, how do you do this? So who leaves South Africa and forms their own country? Do you have the Western Cape, the Republic of Western Cape? If you did that 50 years ago, it'd be largely white and colored, and maybe you could get away with it. But today, an awful lot of Xhosa and others have moved into the Western Cape and now live there. Would they be willing to go along with that? So, it really becomes a bit of a sticky wicket, as English like to say, and when you try to devolve. And so, a lot of people talk about using the Northern Cape as an Afrikaner homeland. I'm not really sure that makes sense. One of the problems with when you devolve and you follow self-determination is you can self-determine yourself into a path of no development, no growth, and no economic opportunity. Countries and territories can only survive when they're viable economically. You can't just have a culture. If you have nothing to eat, your culture will disappear and your people will die. So it's a question, I think, but people are based trying to break up South Africa.
I would agree with you. It's not really seen as secession, although that's the term word that people like to use. Self-determination, yes, because Orania itself is a closed corporation. It's a CC. And they've got like over 200 businesses in that little town. Mm-hmm. There's also two other organizations. USF is one of them, Rodney Bartman, and the other one is ULF, which is Hein Marx. Germ Wolfe, he had a podcast with Hein Marx. I'm going to share the link also into my podcast on that one. The viewers out there can also take a look at that. But yeah, self-determination, yes. Will it work? Yeah. It's working for Orania. Yes, I know the media, you spoke about it. The media has tried their best. And Karel, I think it's Karel Boshoff.
Yeah, Karel Boshoff, yes.
He invites them. He tells them, come over. The EFF has been there and he's told them, come have a look at Orania and they failed. They tried their utmost best to try and prove to the world that Orania is a racist town, but it's not. They believe in cultural beliefs in it, and I think people just don't seem to understand that what they stand for. Yeah, that's the confusion.
But it's quite easy because people who simply look at someone and make a determination based on their appearance or their skin pigmentation, aside from the fact that they're either bigoted or racist, are selling themselves short by not addressing what's going on. So if you look at people who are willing to engage, so you've got two examples in the last decade or so, a little over a decade now, but you have a colored community from, Esteros, something like that, a colored community who went there to learn how Orania was managing their affairs. So they were trying to improve management of this community. It was largely based with coloreds. And so they went there and they learned things from them, they shared things, and they had nothing but positive comments about Orania. And then in 2012, a Xhosa group from, this name is, the renaming campaign gets a little challenging for me at times here. I can say Shwana fine, but some of these are tough. So Nyamyene, it's a Xhosa community, and they went there. They have a cooperative agreement with Orania now for protecting culture and some economic ties, and they're getting along just fine. That's 8 years ago. So those who actually are willing to open their minds and listen to people rather than just make presumptions actually can see something useful. So the example of Orania, I think, is one that, as long as the government of South Africa allows that, and as long as the people of Orania comply with South African law, which they are, it can work. Now, anyway, that's true. Interesting thing. If you look at the 2019 election results, I looked them up for Orania. There were 550 votes cast out of a community of 1,650, so about a 65% turnout. The Freedom Front Plus, of course, as you might presume, they won the most votes, 79% of the votes, with 447. The DA lost a little bit of votes, and they had 62. But the Economic Freedom Front got 21 votes in Orania.
Yeah.
Now that might have stopped some people. And then Cope also got 8 votes. That's not much, but the point is that the presumption is that it would all be National Front or Freedom Front plus votes. No, not entirely. People can think for their own. Now some people have come and gone from Orania. They didn't find it to their liking.
Yeah.
But the community has grown from 481 in 2000 to 1,602 in 2018. So clearly,
looks like they're doing something right. Economically, their town is booming.
Yeah.
They sell their own beer there. They brew their own beer there.
Yeah.
I don't know what the property prices. Last time I did research, their property prices soared to the roof.
Yeah.
But it's important to know that they don't exploit people. There's no exploitation there. They use everybody jumps in and works and builds the town together. That's what I like. I like that. Yeah.
Well, I like the capital aspect of it, but the social aspect. I'm not Amish. I'm not into building the barn with my community on Saturday, which is I think kind of the mindset of Orania. So I have nothing against it, but it's not me personally. But I do wish them well. They seem to have a good idea for protecting their culture and their language, and they're trying to make it last. But yeah, it's the size of Orania has grown, not just because people are having 27 children each, but because people actually come to the community. It's grown because of net migration into Orania.
Yeah.
So,
I can also now I was going to say, I can imagine also the discipline. I mean, the discipline and respect, morality. This is something that most of Africans are losing grip on. Morality, especially.
Mm-hmm.
And we're losing grip on it. And I think Orania stands for that. Orania stands for that we must not forget that our elders, we need to respect them. Morality, just keep that in place. And we're losing fast. We're losing fast on morality. It's scary.
What's good about for Orania is that when it comes to expropriation, the Karel Bussel actually started, or I think he was the founder, started buying land there around 1991 or something like, or 2000, no, 91 to set up the community.
Yeah, it was 91, yeah. The land was purchased in 1960, somewhere in the 60s. The land was purchased, and then in the 90s, it was in the 60s, and then in the 90s, it became known as Orania. Yeah.
Okay. Well, but my point is that this, of course, is pre-94, and so that would be land that if anyone had a claim against it, it could be put back to 1910 and be contested. So in 2005, November 25, a group of about 20 colored families laid a claim against the land. Now, I'm not sure how they did it in 2005. That was outside the window for filing claims, but nonetheless, they laid a claim against it. The government, the national government, the ANC government settled the land claim for financial. They gave the group of families 2.9 million rand. So they've already gone through land claims. And so the land there should be theirs free title and shouldn't be a question in the future. So that's some good news, I guess, for them when we've got all these other people running around talking about confiscating land. So hopefully that won't be an issue for Orania.
Yeah, but that's just the thing, what's happening with this EWC at the moment. A lot of people seem to take the cash more than what they are actually taking the land and making a success of it. But there is people. I've seen lots of success stories of black people taking land and turning it into a successful business. 100%, it can be done. But the fact remains that the majority of them are not interested in land. They'd rather take the cash. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, I mean, the first round of how, since we're talking about this, the first round of claims on land was from 95 to 99, and a 5-year period there. There were about 75,000 claims lodged. And of course, this is any claim back to 1910 with the Union of South Africa Act when the country was actually created. So of those, over 73,000 of those claims were long settled, most of those 10, 15 years ago. The majority having been, as you said, financial compensation. But that's because a lot of those claims are urban claims, like District 6 in Cape Town. You're not going to tear down the property values of that place down or transfer it to someone that's too disruptive economically. So most of those people took cash settlement. Now, we can debate about whether the cash was fair or was reasonable. That's a different argument. But the truth of the matter is that land was put into question, and most of those claims were resolved. Unfortunately, during the Zuma era, we reopened the land issue. And not unfortunately, this should be reopened. But we reopened it, and there were over 140,000 claims, many of which were not valid or fraudulent, and they're working through that backlog now. And of course, the ANC understands the department responsible for this and underfunds it. If you look at this year, they gave ESCOM 16 billion or something like that. Mm-hmm. They promised them 16 billion, and they promised SAA another 4 billion, I think it was. Yeah, 4 billion. But that was just a loan guarantee. The money for ESCOM was actually money, but for SAA it was only a loan guarantee. SAA went to the credit market, could only manage to borrow 2 billion rand, so they never drew the other 2 billion. And then, of course, they famously came back and just asked for 10 billion more. The point I'm making here is 60 billion rand for ESCOM, yet again, SAA 4 billion, yet they budgeted 33 million US dollars for land, to purchase land. I can't even buy a decent wine estate in Western Cape for $33 million. It's a sick joke. So their argument is they have to confiscate land because it's necessary. Well, it would be necessary if the last 26 years have been used productively to purchase land that's available for sale. Before this EWC debate came about, you could go look at farms all over the country, habitually every year on sale, acreage available that the government could have purchased. Anyway, we could spend hours talking about that.
Yeah, I know. Let's go on to the next question.
Sure.
Colonialism, was it good or bad for Africa? And if it was bad, could it have been avoided? Touchy question. I don't know. Colonialism.
Well,
the British.
I think what I'll do is avoid making any tweets about it. I don't want to be lambasted like Helen Zillow was.
Good one.
All right, so let's talk about this. Okay, this is an issue that drives me absolutely bonkers because it's just full of identity politics, and it's full of all sorts of things that are just unpleasant. But not colonialism itself, of course, that is an issue that's unpleasant in many respects. But the aftermath and the ranting about colonialism, blaming colonialism for everything. If you believe in evolution, we all come from Africa. If you believe in it. And so if that's true, my ancestors were smart enough to get the hell out of Africa about, 60,000, 40,000 years ago and get across to Yemen and start moving north to the Caucasus and then hanging out with the Neanderthals and knocking boots occasionally, I guess. And so next thing you know, we've got Europeans and we're living in the colder latitudes. Anyway, the point being is that when it comes to colonialism, this is a story of Homo sapiens. This is a story of mankind. There's been colonialism since we started walking upright and walked to the next patch of veld or forest and beat our neighbors across the head with a bone, killed them and took their women. Colonialism has been throughout the history of mankind. What we've seen in the last few centuries is European colonialism, and that's the issue people are talking about. Well, yes. They conveniently forget previous colonialism. For instance, in Africa, when I taught students at the Army War College, and anytime I've spoken about Africa, I do this because it's provocative. So I ask this question, and I'll ask it of you if you don't mind. Okay, so let me not to put you on the spot, but just to see what your answer is. So okay. Africa famously has a few places that were never colonized. They never went through colonization. Can you tell me which countries in Africa in the popular narrative have never been colonized?
Ethiopia is one of them.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Can you give me another one?
I can't think. No, it's not Congo. No.
No. Okay.
I can only think of Ethiopia.
I'll help you. So the popular narrative, particularly about among Pan-Africanists and Black nationalists, is that Ethiopia was never colonized and Liberia was never colonized.
What's that? What?
Liberia.
Liberia. Okay.
Yes. But I provocatively tell them that you're full of nonsense. That's simply not true. Liberia was settled by former slaves and free blacks who came from America and landed on the shores of West Africa, where they imposed an alien political system on a people who were already living there. And they created a political system almost identical to the American because that's the experience they knew, the House, Senate, a president, a Supreme Court. So they replicated that and they imposed it on Africans. The fact that their skin was brown or black doesn't mean they didn't colonize. In fact, they did. They, in fact, also economically exploited the people who were there. And so the Americo-Liberian community, which was never more than 5% of the population at its peak, has ruled that country from its inception in the 1820s, 30s, 40s until 1980 when Samuel Doe's indigenous group army overthrew them. So they, in fact, were colonized. The fact that the people who colonized them were black doesn't mean they weren't colonized. They were colonized. When it comes to Ethiopia, we could talk about the long history of Ethiopia, the Tigrayans and the Somalis and all the other people who live inside Ethiopia who have been colonized by the Amharic speakers, the core of Ethiopia. That's one story. But I want to point out that from 1936 until 1941, the Italians conquered Addis Ababa and colonized the capital. Now, true, Ethiopians fought in the bush and in the woods and the hills against the Italian occupation, but it was occupied and colonized for 5 years. Now, that one really gets a lot of Ethiopians hot under the collar, but technically speaking, my argument is sound. The only country in all of Africa, in my view, that's never been colonized is Botswana. And people say, wait a second, but Botswana wasn't it Bechuanaland? I said, yes, it was Bechuanaland, and it was not a colony, it was a protectorate. Now, there were other protectorates that were actually colonized, like Namibia. Southwest Africa was actually colonized. It wasn't simply a protectorate. But here's the deal with Bechuanaland. The Dukosi, the main chiefs of the Tswana-speaking peoples, or Setswana, as they say in Botswana now, they approached the Brits in South Africa and said, listen, we're concerned about incursions of Afrikaners, these Boers who were coming into Botswana, and they're concerned about them taking land, taking prime land, and conflict with them. So in order to make this an area that would not wind up with a lot of Afrikaner Boer settlement, the British government declared a protectorate after the request from the African chiefs. But Bechuanaland was so unimportant to the British government that the capital wasn't even in Bechuanaland. Gaborone was not the capital. Mafeking was. That's in South Africa. That's in South Africa. So they cared so little about it. Now, the reason this matters is that the traditional systems of leadership and political control under the chiefs, the Kosi, the Dikosi, remain largely in place during the period of protectorate status. The Brits simply managed the foreign affairs and defense and things like that for Bechuanaland. When it became an independent country in 1966, that system was subjugated or relegated to a constitutional parliamentary system, but it still exists. And so it's a parallel system that works in concert with, anyway, the point being is that, so I tell people the only country in Africa that's never been colonized is Botswana. But of course, that's not entirely true too, because the Bantu pushed the Bushmen in. Anyway, you get my point. So when it comes back to colonialism, the whole history of mankind, in my view, is a matter of movements of peoples and occupation, extermination, incorporation, or colonization of others. That's just the story of human being. Some of it's been positive, a lot of it's been negative. It just depends what you're talking about. But what you're talking about, I believe, is the European period of recent history. So in South Africa's case, it started in 1652. I will say that colonialism for the Khoi and San in the Western Cape was an absolute disaster. It was horrible, absolutely horrible for them. And that colonialism from a Bantu stance, from the Bantus coming down about 1800 years ago, from the Rift Valley, moving into what became Zimbabwe, and then into the eastern part of South Africa, and breaking into groups and eventually forming the Swazis and the Zulu and the Bele and the Xhosa and all these groups. Yeah. So the Bantu migration it displaced Khoi and San. Now, some of these people were violently displaced, and some of them actually got along with the new Bantus. And that was colonization as well. So, is it good or bad? Well, what I will say is take Rhodesia, for example. The system that they had in Rhodesia was not apartheid, but it was very race-based and discriminatory, and Black Africans were held down and not given an opportunity or not allowed to have access to opportunity. So it was simply wrong. And the UDI under Ian Smith, their effort to run a minority-ruled country, I understand why that happened, but it got them on the wrong path. But in 1980, when ZANU-PF won the election and took over Zimbabwe, they had functioning roads, they had functioning power systems, despite sabotage that was going on in the conflict, and they had poor education for Black Africans, but good education for everybody else. And they had a light industrial sector, they had a robust economy, agricultural based, and they had some successes early on. My point here is that they inherited something. One of the best pieces of advice that Mugabe got that he never followed, he followed for a bit, but then he abandoned it eventually, was advice from Julius Nyerere from Tanzania. And he told him, he said, you've inherited the crown jewel of Africa. Don't ruin it. Basically, don't chase the whites off, because they're a critical part of your economy. If you look at Mozambique and Angola, which have horrible colonial histories as to oppression of Africans, what happened as part of independence was the fear. So a lot of Portuguese fled. Now you have to understand that Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and Angola were considered part of Portugal. They were considered the overseas provinces of it, much like North Africa was considered part of France for a long time. And so hundreds of thousands of Portuguese lived in Africa, in Angola and Mozambique in particular, about 600,000 or so in Angola and about 300,000 in Mozambique. They fled for the most part, most of them. And those that didn't flee, a lot of them were pushed out or chased out of the country. And as a consequence, you look at Mozambique, its entire economy just collapsed because there were no people who were trained to do anything. So colonialism provided a framework. Of course, the counter argument to this is, well, maybe this framework would have developed without colonialism, and that's a counterfactual. One can have it, but looking at the state of technological development advancement of most societies in Africa when Europeans landed there, there was a disparity there, and so Africa could have caught up. And if you look at Africa today, because of technology, parts of Africa catch up and reach the rest of the world and sometimes exceed. One of the things that I noticed back in many years ago was that when I lived in Italy, I had a mobile phone in the States, and it was a Motorola, and it weighed like, a kilo, and you had to flip.
I had one too. Yes, I had one too.
The battery lasts for like 3 hours, it would die. And my phone was about 5 miles long by about 3 miles wide. And anything outside that was a toll call. And I hated it. I was paying $40 a month US in the 90s, which was a lot of money. So I went to Italy, and I was assigned to Italy, and I got a GSM phone. This is early days of GSM. A SIM card. I walked out of the store, it turned on, it worked, no contract, and I paid the equivalent of 30 US cents to call anywhere in Europe 24 hours a day. I'm like, wait a second, this is what Africa needs. Because part of what's holding Africa back is the telephone lines. If we can skip the telephone lines, and look what happened. Look what happened. This is, and the list goes on. And another reason, because there's not enough banking, retail banking.
Yeah, and it made a few richer. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people rich. Look, Strive Zero in Zimbabwe is a billionaire because of mobile telecommunications, and the list goes on and on. Mo Ibrahim is a billionaire because of the money he got from mobile communications. So, but then there's other things that help Africa. So you have mobile money, M-Pesa, where people use their mobile phone to transfer payments instead of going to Western Union or MoneyGram and getting ripped off by them. They get ripped off by the phone companies. so they can transfer money that way. But that was another revolution. So my point is that Africa today can catch up and surpass or equal much of the world. But there was a time in which Africa technologically and politically was lagging the world. And that's when colonialism took place, European colonialism. Yeah. Was it good? It depends on your perspective. It really does. But I think too much of the argument, the moment someone brings a word up, is automatically painted and cloaked in race. And that's what the focus of it is. So a lot of what's lost about the Afrikaans people is that, people forget that they were trying to get away from the English. The whole Great Trek was about getting away from the English. It wasn't about imposing on Africans. They were already doing that. They were just trying to get away from the English. But anyway. So.
Yeah, it's important to know that in today's society, the question that I asked you, was it good or bad? It can lead to a lot of discriminations. I know that's not the idea. That's not the idea. It's this whole podcast is about economy driven, and we're just in a slump hole at the moment, and I'm just trying to look for ways to get out of the slump hole, and we can, I know, but there's just this lot of discrimination and hatred that needs to be forgotten about. We just need to forget about that.
If I were king for the day, these are the following actions I would take. Now, there have these immediate actions, but long term, I have. So let me tell you immediate for South Africa, and then long term economic. Immediately, I would suspend BEE, and I would draft legislation to remove it. I would suspend the discussion about expropriation without compensation, and I would just dismiss the discussion about national health insurance immediately.
Yeah, the NHI,
that would send a strong message to foreign investors about the economy. Next, I would go looking at a long-term plan, and instead of talking about education and doing nothing about it, actually devote resources to education. When South Africa moved to all-race elections in 1994 in a democratic society, I was a young man, and I said, people have to be patient. And they said, what do you mean? I said, listen, you have to understand that there are 2 lost generations amongst much of the Black community in South Africa. And what do you mean? Well, what happened in the 80s in particular is that the only form of protest that people could have against apartheid in that system was simply not to go to school. And because so many Black children refused to go to school because of the second attempt to impose Afrikaans as the median language for education. And so civil disobedience became the norm for 2 generations of Black South African children. Not all, but many. And so a lot of them grew up without proper education. And the Bantu education wasn't particularly good to begin with for most Black South Africans. Some Bantu get good education. So you already have a system that's not well geared towards training people to be effective, efficient in the society in the future. And now you have 2 generations of people, many of whom are functionally illiterate. Jacob Zuma can't even read, There's a reason for that. And it's not simply apartheid. It's also because he joined the struggle and didn't pursue his education. Anyway, my point is that I told people you must be patient because it will take 20 to 30 years for the ANC to fix education so that young kids grow up with a proper education and can move on to other opportunity, whether it's trade school, entrepreneurialism, agriculture, or university. But instead of fixing education, we've broken it. And now I think it's quite embarrassing for South Africa that in order to be considered a graduate of high school where you take the matric, you only need a 40% passing score. And so the ANC crows about the fact that they're not high school graduates. 80% of people graduating from high school in South Africa aren't literate. I don't want the structural engineer who graduated with a 46 in maths to be building my bridge or my apartment building. That's insane. So stop lying to people and actually get real education. An early trip I had after apartheid in 2000 is I went to Stellenbosch and I met a nice lady at a shop. She had started her own shop. And I had a conversation with her because I speak German fluently and she had German ancestors, and it came out in the course of the conversation. I was buying stuff in her shop. And so we were talking. And she told me she used to be a teacher. She taught in primary school, but she was pushed out and given a small severance package because she's Afrikaans speaking. They didn't want her in the school anymore because many of the students were black and the educators didn't want her there. Now that's anecdotal, that's one case. My point is that she was a qualified teacher ostensibly, and she was capable of teaching. She was pushed out. And what can we get in its place? In KwaZulu-Natal, where 75 to 78% of the male teachers are HIV positive, and sadly, it's a sad fact of life here. People want to ignore it and look the other way. But in many parts of South Africa, and not just South Africa, it's elsewhere, girls get their grades in school, the expectation that they have sexual intercourse with their teacher. Now, when you have teachers preying on prepubescent and pubescent girls, how in the world do they learn proper human interaction, let alone the fact that they probably become infected with a deadly virus and or die? In addition to that, pregnancy and all these things. So instead of teaching kids, they're preying on kids. And then we have Eastern Cape famously where BEE companies never deliver textbooks. I've been to schools in KwaZulu-Natal in the rural countryside, and I've seen places with no electricity, no plumbing. They're using pit latrines outside. This is unacceptable. You can't get a proper education, never mind that proper nutrition. One of the biggest factors in Africa why Africa doesn't do better is because so many African children have stunted growth. From the age of birth to the age of 5, they don't get proper protein for their brain to develop in the proper fashion. Now, that is not a black thing. That is not an African thing. That is an economic and governance failure. And so I would, coming out of this, devote and pour lots of money into genuine education, to fixing, rehabilitating schools, setting standards, holding people to standards, prosecuting people who abuse students and things like that, and actually teach South African children. But then we're starting from ground zero. We still have now 3 generations or 4 generations of kids who are largely lost. Not entirely lost, but largely lost.
Yeah, it's scary.
And so
scary. Yeah.
That's what I would do. But I would get rid of all these other things first, and then I would focus on education. And so I think that's the key. And the ANC is not interested in that.
No,
a lot of people cynically say that the ANC is happy that people don't have an education because the ignorant are easy to sway with votes. I hope that's not the case.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, you start to shake your head at some point about whether it indeed is the case. But doing business in South Africa is incredibly complicated in large measure because of these policies that the ANC has put in place. And it's damaging the country. I haven't even touched on state capture and corruption. Those are corrosive to what's going on too. But even if those things continue, because there'll always be corruption, there's always people trying to take advantage of others. But even if those things continue, the country can be saved economically, but you need right-minded policies. And the answer in South Africa is not that, like I heard the videotape of Cyril Ramaphosa when he was speaking in Parliament. I forget when this was, but I remember hearing it. And he said, he was talking about John Steenhuisen, and he said, well, that's because he's white, and that it's the whites who wanted apartheid. I'm sorry, did you miss the vote in 1992 in which 63% of the white population of South Africa voted to end apartheid? I'm sorry, you must have missed that.
True,
So
a lot of, exactly.
Lumping 6 million people together based on their skin pigmentation is just ludicrous. The white population in South Africa is not even homogenous. First off, the Afrikaans-speaking community is predominantly by DNA German. It's the largest group, then Dutch, and then French Huguenot, and then others mixed in there. So that's the Afrikaans community. And then you have a large Portuguese-speaking community of 300 to 400 to 500,000 South Africans. And you have English-speaking community, which includes Greeks and English and all kinds of other people around the world. And then, of course, that's just the white community. And so, anyway, it drives me nuts when people make those ludicrous claims. That'd be like me saying that, well, black people are lazy. That's asinine, and that's stupid. That's simply not true. Yeah, anyway.
Drives us all nuts. Colonel, have you still got time? Because we've been an hour. I don't want to take. We still got time. Okay. My last question, and we've touched a lot of it on base. Of all the pandemics the world has experienced, will we ever learn and apply the right systems or ideologies that we need to move forward and create a better future for our children, for their children and our children? And we've touched the base on it now a lot of it. What you said there, 100%, I agree with you. My previous podcast I had with a guy by the name of Sky, and he also said the same thing. It's education. We need to implement more and more education. But it seems like the government that we got and the NDR, are you familiar with the NDR?
No, I didn't. What's that?
The NDR, are you familiar with the NDR? The National Democratic Revolution. Yeah, National Democratic Revolution.
I've just not heard people use the acronym. Yes.
Yeah. You know, they just forcing upon this socialism or communist, and you know, the roots of the NDR takes us back to the days of Russia, you know, Stalin in those days. Is that the right ideology for this country?
I don't think it's the right ideology. I don't think it's healthy for South African, because the problem with a system like that is it leaves too much space for malfeasance, and we've seen that. So if you go back to when the ANC first started to rule, and it was in a coalition with the National Party and had two deputy presidents, de Klerk and Thabo Mbeki. At that time, Tony Yengeni getting a discounted loan as a form of corruption to buy a car was a big deal, and it was only a few thousand rand. We've gone from that to people pilfering billions of rands and giving money to foreigners and all kinds of access. So when you have a system in which, I'll get to the pandemic in a second, but let me answer this. So one of the problems I have with this is that people forget that governments exist because human beings created governments to address their common needs and common concerns. So for instance, we, as a polity, as a group, a body politic, we create a government to represent us or to meet our needs and for the common good. So that would be defense. It would be, you know, for public services that are required that only the body politic as whole can deliver. But what happens is that people like to go down these different paths with this, and they get to the point where they think government is the answer or government is smarter. You know, I jokingly say, and not too jokingly, when people here in America have great reverence for our members of Congress, I remind them that, you know, they're just the better dressed used car salesman or ambulance chasing lawyer who's got the gift for gab and looks good on television and who got elected in many cases. They're not experts on epidemiology or on finance or economics. Some are, but few are. And my point is that people implicitly trust government when, in my view, government works for us. We don't work for government. Now, it sounds odd for a guy who spent 36 years in uniform, but I was serving the people, was my view, not serving the government. I followed lawful and moral orders from my government, but I was there to protect the freedoms, liberties of the people, whether it's the American people or our friends, partners, and allies. But on to the pandemic. So, no, I don't think that the Marxist and socialist is the right answer. So that was the point there. Yeah. On the pandemic, this is particularly disheartening for me, and let me explain why. HIV came along. We didn't know what it was. Originally, it was called GRID, gay-related infectious disease, because most of the cases were being observed in the homosexual community in the early 1980s. Eventually, French virologists at the Pasteur Institute in France, and then Americans at almost the same moment discovered that HIV was the causal factor leading to AIDS. And that was 1983. Do we have a vaccine? No. Have we learned? Yes. We've learned a lot about HIV, and we've learned a lot about the cultural, social, and economic impacts of it, and we're forced part of today. But we've had 40 years, nearly 40 years to deal with HIV. So we had a scare here in the United States in the early 1990s with a simian version of Ebola that came in here from the Philippines, of all places, and wiped out, famously, if you're familiar with the book The Hot Zone by Richard Preston, or the movie Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman, which was inspired from the book. Now there's a National Geographic series on it. But anyway, so we had that warning, and we should have known better. In the Army, in Africa, a lot of what I did was provide training and conferences to help our friends, partners, and allies. So one of the things we did with Africa Command when it was founded in 2007 and got going in 2008 was that we had a pandemic response program to work with African militaries and civil sector, the health ministries and such. And we held conferences and did strategic planning and put this in place. all over Africa. So when the Ebola crisis happened in 2013, 2014, the Nigerians were hit with Ebola before they knew it, because people came from Liberia and Sierra Leone and flew to Nigeria and brought Ebola in with them. But the Nigerian health authorities, based on their own professionalism, and there's a great degree of professionalism in that community, and the things they learned from the pandemic response program working with the US military and the World Health Organization, not a fan of theirs, but working together, they had an excellent response. They quarantined people, they isolated people, they had sound procedures for testing and for maintaining what they needed to do. So that should have been the canary in the coal mine, but it wasn't. And even before that, we have West Nile, we have MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, we have SARS, Sudden Acute Respiratory Syndrome, we have H1N1, we have
N1, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The list goes on and on and on. And for those who don't remember a century ago, because very few people are alive when it happened, it's still alive today, and if they were infants then. But in 1918 and 1919, of course, we had the Spanish influenza.
The Spanish flu, yeah. Which was a major pandemic, yeah.
I had over 20 people in my family who died here on the East Coast of Maryland in 1918, 1919 from influenza, over 20. Because I'm a genealogist and I follow my family history, I can go to a graveyard and show you the sad memorial in which about 16 of them buried in the same grave. The point is that we should have learned. And in this modern age, when we have ability to track viruses, we have the ability to monitor these things, we have the ability to map their RNA very quickly. And we can share information, because what we're doing right now, you can talk to someone on the other side of the world. We don't have to infect each other. We can share the information. It is, in my view, inexcusable that this has occurred. Now, it occurred for a lot of reasons. I blame a lot of people. But what is going on here is something that was preventable. And so this will recur. Let's pretend that we vanquish this now. Well, the Southern Hemisphere going into winter and we're going into summer. Let's pretend that we vanquish it and we have almost no cases and we resume a normal life as possible. Well, what happens when it reappears in November, December, and we find it because it's in a reservoir somewhere? It exists, and now it's infecting human populations. It will be back. Do we shut the world down again? And what about the next virus that does this? This isn't the first one. This ran through the virus. So in my view, this is a lack of leadership on the part of national political leaders around the world. And a lot of people want to resort to say, let's get the World Health Organization and the United Nations. No. You know, an interesting fact about the World Health Organization, over half their budget is spent on staff salaries and travel. Most of what they do is travel around and stay in hotels and attend conferences. They do some useful things. I'm not trying to denigrate the World Health Organization, but they're not the organization that's responsible for this. Some countries are very well equipped. You know, the South African military has a medical health intelligence activity. One of only 2 countries in the world, the United States and South Africa, have a medical intelligence unit that follows these sorts of things. But anyway, the point is that we should have been better prepared, and I think a lot of decisions being made now, from my perspective, are not the right ones. South Africa, for instance, really, really needs to address the informal economy. You cannot keep 80% of the people who have any form of employment, which is already a small portion of the population to begin with, locked in houses. And then this is exacerbated. You see what the Red Ants have been doing with Johannesburg Metro Police, destroying informal stuff.
I saw that, yeah. Very sad. Very sad. It's
very
terrible.
Sad. It's
terrible.
Yeah, and so they're making these people homeless. This is just brain dead, and that's actually it contravenes the Disaster Management Act, and then in Section 11C, telling people they can't. And the Justice Minister Lamola told people no evictions during this for the duration of lockdown, and the police go out there with the Red Ants and they break people's homes and make them live on the high veld. It's just insane.
Look, some of the regulations that the government has enforced, a lot of us don't understand it. For instance, like the alcohol and cigarettes one, nobody understands it. But then if you go into detail and you think logically, what goes on inside townships and rural areas when they buy beers and when they buy cigarettes, they share it. They share the cigarettes and they beer bottle and they take a sip and they pass it on to their friends. And I think that's what the government is really afraid of. And bearing in mind, we haven't really hit winter yet, and being this a seasonal thing, this COVID, we don't know what to expect. And I think that's what's happening here. They are afraid. They don't know what to expect because winter's coming. So yeah, we're on level 5 at the moment. The president announced it last night. Next week, Friday, we're going to head for level 4, which will see some industrials like mines and that farming that can go on. If that goes well, of course, if the infection rate is kept at a low, then we'll head for level 3. And level 3 is retail clothing. Bottle stores will open, but not completely. And then level 2 and then level 1. But if all this cannot be contained, the virus cannot be contained, then we're going to go back to level 5. And we're all up in arms now. We're worried about this now. I mean, we're sitting in it at our homes, hoping that level 4 is a success so we can get to level 3 and then slowly but surely get our economy back on track. But I really hope so, Colonel. I hope so.
No, it's a real disaster. And I think part of the problem, not just in South Africa, but also here and elsewhere, is the lack of transparency. Now, a lot of people are saying the government's being transparent, but they're not. For instance, the people of South Africa are owed an explanation why they can't purchase alcohol, an explanation why the government thinks it's in the best interest of the community not to have alcohol sales.
They didn't do that.
Simply let people
Yeah.
What's that?
The president didn't do it. He didn't really give a proper explanation. Yeah.
No, and so people speculate and wonder, and then you have all sorts of things. You're going to have a case where people are going to venture to other people's homes to break in their homes just to get alcohol because they're alcoholic and they need it. That's going to happen if it hasn't already happened. There's all kinds of social ills tied to this. And I find it very frustrating, the lack of transparency when it comes to things that they should let people know about. We have an alcohol ban here, but it's a sale, on the sale of alcohol. Now, I'm talking about hard liquor. You can still buy beer here in Pennsylvania, but you can't buy hard liquor. And we were never told what the case was, why that is the case. I know why it happened, because here, our package stores, the hard liquor stores, are all controlled by the state. They're state-owned. So we have state-owned enterprise. That's in this state. Not every state's like that. And so the state can shut them down, and they did. That was something that was under the control. And that makes a little bit nervous. The one thing I wanted to make sure I got across here before we left is that this is a central planner's dream. There must be Soviet 10-year plan writers rolling in their graves, clapping their hands, going, wow, the whole world has central planning. Look at this. The government decides who gets to open, when they get to operate, who gets to buy what, where they get to go. This is what we dreamed of.
It's power hungry. Yeah, it's power hungry. And the ANC is loving it. They're drunk on the power at the moment.
Well, that's the real challenge here. Now, there's one other thing I want to add too. Is we were talking about secession earlier, or self-determination. One of the things to bear in mind is that when people so easily accept government taking their liberties because of a crisis, whether it's 9/11, oh, we must observe everyone's communications now because the terrorists are everywhere, or it's COVID-19 and you can't leave your house and only people in this industry can work. When you surrender your liberty to a government, remember, the government's supposed to represent us, not us work for them. When you surrender your liberty, bear in mind that it is the normal practice of every ruling party in every country to go out of its way to entrench its position into perpetuity. And in South Africa's case, I can give you a couple examples. The first of which was that it passed by, hardly noticed, but the government of South Africa changed the municipality so they have these super metro areas now, like Nelson Mandela Bay instead of Port Elizabeth, and you have Tshwane, and you have Durban and Joburg and Pretoria, or Tshwane is Pretoria, and Cape Town. And why did they do that? Well, by incorporating all the small villages and towns into a huge geographic area, what do? In the towns where there is a different ethnic composition or cultural composition, say a small Afrikaans-speaking community on the edge of Johannesburg, which is rural, and the mayor is an Afrikaner and gets elected, and maybe from the opposition party. Well, now you swamp that community and a Xhosa community further to the south, or a Basotho community, who would have had someone who's Basotho be mayor. Now it's all part of the Joburg Metro. And how many mayors does it have? One. And who do they get it from? The ruling party, because that's where the majority of votes are in the main metro. So the expansion of the metropolitan areas diminished the ability for opposition parties to develop by having people who have political experience serving on councils and as mayors and planners and things like that. And it weakens South Africa's democracy. And this is the nature of what political parties do, whether it's the CDU in Germany or the SPD or the Tories or Labour, the Democrats, Republicans, it doesn't matter. So when you, South Africans and Americans and Botswana and Brits and Germans, when you so easily look to government to solve all of your problems because you're scared, remember, it's going to be hard to get those things back.
You're absolutely right. I mean, South Africa for a long time now, we're not used to this. We're not used to pandemics and it. But you look at your country, America, constant terrorism, they're used to it. And then what happens, you get this dependency. They depend on the government to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you talked earlier about, you said, Italy and the U.S. can afford this, because they have resources. We can get by it as a nation, but the damage economically and culturally and politically, I think, is going to be catastrophic if we don't come out of this soon. And the Italians don't have the resources. They're in trouble. Their debt was already larger than their annual GDP to begin with before this even started.
Okay.
So they have a serious problem. We can survive it, but we've done it at the cost of future generations. The Federal Reserve is printing money once again, so devaluing our dollar by flooding the money supply as necessary in their terms with $4 trillion of liquidity. That's quantitative easing. That's the nonsense that happened in the Obama years, which eviscerated the US dollar. So quantitative easing, $4 trillion. The first rescue package was $2.2 trillion. Now they've just approved another, which is going to be another 2 or 4 trillion somewhere in there. So we're talking about somewhere between $6 and $10 trillion or more. Our economy, the federal government in a year is $4.3 trillion a year. Our total economy is $23 trillion. So half of our GDP this year is going to be bailout money or rescue money. That is all debt for the most part.
Well, that's our debt, 4 trillion. Well, I don't know. I suppose it's more now. 4 trillion. Yeah.
Yeah, but I say, so I get like 300 Rand to the dollar today?
Colonel, okay, I think we're gonna call it.
Okay.
Don't go. I'm just gonna say my closing. But Colonel, I'm gonna plug in your link to your YouTube channel. What's it called again?
So if people search for it, it's just under Chris Wyatt and put Chris Wyatt Africa. Chris Wyatt Africa, and it'll show up.
I'll plug in the link. Yeah, I'll plug in the link. Okay. My podcast is available on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, many radio podcasts. This one will also be broadcasted on YouTube and on BitTube. And yeah, Colonel, thank you very much. You've been absolutely awesome. And we'll get through this. We'll get through this. Thank you, Colonel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me as a guest. I enjoyed it. I hope that people listen to the conversation, because you get some iTunes in the middle of that and we're talking about colonialism and go, this guy believes in colonialism. No, not at all. Listen to the entire discussion, folks.
Yeah.
Anyway, but thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on. I really appreciate the invitation, and perhaps one day you can join me on my channel.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. Thank you.